Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. If you're writing a novel about Russians repelling invaders and you choose to call it Life and Fate, you're setting yourself a high bar. Vasily Grossman certainly intended the comparison with Tolstoy's War and Peace, which was his favourite reading. Grossman, Jewish, short-sighted, slightly plump, trained as a scientist, was one of the least likely heroic war reporters of World War II. But he was there at the siege of Stalingrad, the great tank battles, first into Treblinka, and he then saw the fall of Berlin. He turned savagely against the lies and the anti-Semitism of Stalin's USSR. He is, in a sense, something like a kind of Russian George Orwell, although a better novelist than Orwell. And today's programme is all about him and his great work. I'm joined by Anthony Beevor, the historian, by the novelists Linda Grant and by Andrey, Kurkov, who is, like Grossman, a Ukrainian. And what I thought I'd start by asking you all is, if somebody pressed you against the wall and said, Life and Fate, what sort of a book is it? Let's put to one side that it's incredibly moving and brilliant and so on. Just what sort of book is it? Anthony Beevor.
It is, I think, definitely the 20th century equivalent of War and Peace, and that was a deliberate literary homage on Grossman's part. But in many ways it's much more than War and Peace, because the political element, the humanistic element that it introduces is far broader, far greater. For the very first time, we see the whole question of, is there a moral equivalence between class genocide or racial genocide, the comparison between the Nazi state and the Soviet state, and to what degree these two millstones together actually worked together in crushing everybody in between.
You make it sound quite a daunting prospect for somebody who's looking for a novel to curl up with.
It's a gripping read. The family, I mean, when I refer to War and Peace, it has a similar sprawling, epic family side to it. And the characters are so beautifully written and depicted because of Grossman's power of observation that I think one is completely carried away by them. You know them so well by the end of the book.
Linda, you're somebody who just leapt on this book and has been enthusiastic about it ever since.
Yes, and I'm not somebody who would normally read a book about the Battle of Stalingrad or indeed any form of military history until I read Anthony's book, Berlin, which led me to Grossman. I'm going to slightly disagree with Anthony in his definition. And I'm also going to agree with Vasily Grossman when he said, my book is not political. His overlords and masters said, of course it is political. But I think it isn't, because I think that what he does is, in fact, to take an axe to big ideas. He destroys communism, he destroys fascism, he destroys Christianity in a way. What he does, and here is, I think, the killer quote, for me, the message of the book lies in this. The only true and lasting meaning of the struggle for life lies in the individual, in his modest peculiarities and his right to these peculiarities. And the enormous reward of reading this book is the level of the human and the humane, of a vast variety of characters, from Hitler and Stalin themselves down to an aimless old woman.
Andrey Kurkov, you also come from the same area, and you write novels which have a political content, a satirical content, quite a lot of the time. What about the structure of this book? Because it isn't, in many ways, it starts as a family book, doesn't it?
Well, it starts with beautiful description of horrible sin, of the road to the camp, to the German camp, actually. And I mean, he's extremely talented in writing beautifully about horrible things. I think the book is actually about how wonderful and how difficult it is to be and to stay human and alive. And structurally, it is very complicated, but it reads easily. It reads easily because it's so human and the characters are so trustworthy. And, I mean, he's clinically honest. And, I mean, this clinical honesty gives you almost, I mean, sort of doesn't create any distance between him as the author and you as the reader. So, I mean, you are involved immediately in the things happening to Sister Shaposhnikovs, to Grekov, to Krimov, to all these dozens of characters who are so alive, so active.
He's able to hold together a very, very large cast of characters like Tolstoy
Yes,
could. Yes.
yes.
Yeah. Let's talk about Grossman himself and try and introduce people to him, because I described him as being sort of short-sighted and curly-haired, a bit plump, and he trained as a scientist, which is quite important because science runs its way through this book, doesn't it, Linda?
He pins the character of Viktor Strum, who is, I suppose, the central character of this novel, is a physicist, and he's a physicist at a rather kind of difficult time in Soviet history. He's a physicist during the period of the Doctor's plot, and in fact it's sort of slightly telescoped.
This was an alleged
yes.
Jewish plot against Stalin.
Yes, there was an allegation that Jewish doctors were poisoning Stalin, and this led to an incredible unleashing of anti-Semitism, particularly directed at scientists. And so Viktor Strum finds himself in this kind of really invidious position in his lab, where he is forced to renounce Einstein because Einstein is Jewish. So you have this sort of extraordinary piece of sort of history running through this novel.
He was, through the first part of his life, a very successful, comparatively successful, traditional Soviet novelist, writing social realist novels, which we in the West don't know because they haven't been translated, Anthony.
Yes, but I think that even Gorky, who, for example, admired his writing, was also uneasy at the time because he saw that even though Grossman acknowledged some of the socialist realism definitions or manners of writing, there was still a sort of compulsive, subversive element underneath. And it was really a question of time when that was going to come out. And I think that it was the experience of the war and, of course, the experience of the Holocaust and everything else, which then started to explode afterwards.
Andrey Kurkov, you're a particular admirer of his war reporting and his journalism, because it should be said, this is a novel by a journalist, and it's got the advantages of great journalism with none of the disadvantages of rubbish journalism in it. But he fought very hard to get into the Red Army war correspondence unit, didn't he?
Well, I mean, he could stay in evacuation because he had tuberculosis. He actually was allowed not to go to...
He couldn't see very well.
Yeah,
he wasn't very fit.
Yes. But, I mean, he loved it in a way because he wanted to see the truth. And I think this love for truth actually what drove him to Stalingrad and to the most dangerous places where the war took place. And I think without actually these diaries, war correspondence diaries, the novel wouldn't exist because a lot of things he saw, he actually observed, he used then. There are actually episodes which sort of echo from the diaries, and then you find the traces of them in the book.
He had, I mentioned George Orwell right at the beginning, but he had George Orwell's ability to see very, very sharply things that other people hadn't quite noticed. I think you've used in the past a wonderful example of the dogs.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the myths which existed, I think, and he just picked it up and made it public, about the stray dogs in Stalingrad, in ruins, which could differentiate the noise of German bombers from the noise of Soviet bombers, and they would bark at German bombers, sort of warning the Soviet soldiers to go into hideouts.
There is buried in all of this a pretty hideous story, a lot of humour, of course. And this, Linda, as a novelist, this ability to focus on tiny little details that just tell you much more than pages and pages of sort of political writing.
Yeah, I mean, his background as a journalist, I think, is absolutely critical to the writing of this book, because a great deal of what's in this novel is to do with his ability to see and to listen rather than to sit in a room alone. And so throughout the book there are hundreds, possibly thousands of small vignettes of people he has seen. And he will sort of introduce a character who is only there for 2 pages, for example. He describes a German soldier. This is after the defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad. And he said he was a big man and he was very well respected, but now he is, his clothes are in rags and he's thin. And an old woman comes and says to him, good morning. He says good morning to an old Russian woman, and she says good morning to him. And there is a degree of warmth. And he says, and they forgot this immediately. And there was only one witness to it. And you know that he's the witness. And he has this extraordinary ability not to dive very particularly deeply into character, but to sum up individuals in a sort of a vignette. One of the most remarkable things that I discovered was that when he was a war correspondent, he didn't take any notes. And he was renowned, apparently, for the fact that he could get people to talk. And it's because, of course, he didn't have that sort of distancing thing, the notebook, which makes him official. And he had apparently a prodigious memory, and he would go home and he would take notes. So you have this feeling that you're going through a wormhole into the past, into real life, into the reality of what it was like in the Soviet Union in the 1940s, and it is quite likely that these were all real people that he came across.
One of the greatest ever war correspondents, Anthony?
I think so, purely because he was able to, as Linda says, get the people to talk. But it was also because he took such a passionate interest in the subject. I mean, here, and this is a great paradox, here is Grossman, the most unmilitary Jewish Moscow intellectual, who's actually fascinated by the details of war. And actually, he taught himself a lot right at the beginning, whether it's to shoot a pistol, and of course all the others were rather miffed when he beat them at pistol shooting. And the way that not only did he learn the language, and he loved the slang, he was obviously fascinated by the slang, so that he was able to talk to the soldiers in their own language. And this is the most astonishing thing, that he could win their trust. Even during the Battle of Stalingrad, being trusted by the sniper Chekhov to accompany him on one of his stakeouts and watch him shoot Germans.
And he was always on the front line, going to the most dangerous. I mean, he took extraordinary personal risks.
1,000 days at the front. I mean, it was far beyond any other correspondent.
Actually, other journalists knew where the new offensive will be because, first of all, Grossman was sent there by the newspaper in preparation of the attack of the Soviets.
There's a marvelous quote by the other great Soviet Jewish writer, Isaac Babel, when he's talking about Jews, and he says they have spectacles on their nose and autumn in their hearts, and they play the rowdy at their desks. And Vasily Grossman, you can see by looking at him, here is a picture of a man with spectacles on his nose and autumn in his heart, who does this extraordinary thing of leaving his desk and playing the rowdy out there in the real world.
Absolutely. And he was, of course, incredibly famous in Soviet Russia during the war. He was the Red Army's sort of star correspondent, and they all read his reports until the newspapers fell apart in their hands.
Absolutely, above all the soldiers, because there was so much rubbish, so much propaganda rubbish. Grossman himself ridiculed it when he talked to one other correspondent, the sort who writes a story about how Ivan Pupkin could kill 20 Germans with a spoon. And, I mean, those were some of the grotesque stories which were coming out in 1941 during the great disaster of the retreat. But because Grossman wrote the truth, and at times that put pressure on his own editor, this meant that the soldiers loved him and really did respect him.
And actually, even after the war, one of his articles was published separately and circulated among the judges of Nuremberg process. The article about concentration camps.
He was the first into Treblinka, of course, wasn't he?
Yes, he was the first to enter Treblinka.
Going into Treblinka, the Germans had tried to remove as much as they could of what was there, and Grossman was straight in and started to tell the truth.
But it was partly Grossman's reputation for honesty. One has to remember he was then with the 8th Guards Army, the old army from Stalingrad, that they allowed him to sit in on the interrogation of captured guards and others. So he actually had eyewitness material, contemporary material of that very moment, and that is something which is all historians just long for. And that's in many ways why it is such a brilliant account. Now, he got certain things wrong. in terms of calculations of how many people pass through Treblinka and all the rest of it. That's totally unimportant in a way. The vital thing was that through his imagination, based on fact and entirely on research, he was able to recreate what it was like for the people arriving and the whole process. And it was the detail which made all the difference.
Linda?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm correct in saying that there is nothing left of Treblinka. I mean, it doesn't exist, does it?
Well,
There's nothing there. Yeah, unlike Auschwitz or Theresienstadt, and is probably the last resting place of those relatives of mine who didn't leave Poland at the turn of the last century because they lived not far away. My father was born not far from Treblinka, a town which was used as the staging post. So, what we know about Treblinka is from direct observation. And I think the thing about reporting, which has largely been forgotten in our age of comment journalism, which pervades absolutely everything, or opinion journalism, is getting out of the office and going there. And the point about Vasily Grossman was what he describes is what he saw. It is a description of contemporary reality. It is literally the first draft of history.
So we have this man who has written patriotic, sort of Stalinist novels, certainly except I think he was even at one point nominated for the Stalin Prize, very, very famous as a war correspondent, and deep inside him, something radical is shifting and changing. What's going on, Linda?
Well, when you reach the end of this novel, you are left with something which is so banal you could write it on a greeting card. And yet, because you've reached this conclusion at the end of this book, you have, I think, been on Grossman's own personal journey, which is that what matters is the individual act of kindness, whether it is extraordinarily heroic or banal. And it is because I think he has left behind ideology, and he has replaced ideology with life itself, with human life. I mean, essentially, it's a voyage towards a form of humanism. And this idea of the individual act of kindness, this connection between individuals, this refusal to allow ideas to take the place of the human, is, I think.
Which means he cannot be a Soviet novelist.
He can't be. And I think that reading the book, I think that you actually detect during the course of his writing the book, as he's writing it, you can see the shift as he goes along.
I think it's the experience of the front lines, because there was the only place where soldiers could actually speak their mind. They were so close to death that they didn't give a damn anymore, and they talked about the hated collective farms, the corruption of the nomenclatura, the NKVD. The belief was, and there was a huge optimism which was starting to swell up at this particular moment, was that with the defeat of Nazism, all of the repressive measures of the Soviet state would be able to wither away. But of course, in fact, as we know only too well, 1945, Stalin put the screws back on again.
And even before the war, Grossman had been put in the morally very difficult positions about what do you do when people are knocking at the door, secret police are knocking at the door, who do you denounce, how far do you go to protect people you love. And Strum, his sort of hero in this book, is a compromised and fallible man, isn't he, Andrey?
I think it's very autobiographical character because he himself, Grossman, saved his wife from Gulag, from would-be Gulag, because she was imprisoned. And then, of course, I think 1936-37, these are the years that changed his sort of mind and changed his attitude, because he wouldn't be able to avoid fear. He saw, actually, his colleagues' writers being imprisoned and shot dead. And, I mean, this hysteria, it just was growing in the Soviet society, and I don't believe he could stay just indifferent to this, just believing in the ideal. I mean, he was idealist, and he was very honest idealist, and Andrei Platonov once told him, Vasya, you are Christ. And lots of people then in their memoirs wrote that it was impossible to talk to him, because if he felt some kind of falseness, he would just go berserk.
Let's just jump ahead a little bit. I want to come back to the core of Life and Fate in a minute, to what actually happens to the book, because he settles down to write after the war this extraordinary epic novel. And once Stalin has died, he has this idea that perhaps it can be published. And it goes to the top bureaucrat, really, the top censor, Suslov. Tell us what happens then, Anthony.
Well, before that, he'd actually presented it to the publishing house, who, of course, panicked on reading it. They realized that this was complete dynamite. And that's when it sort of got passed into the political process. And first of all, then the KGB came around, seized the manuscripts. But they didn't actually arrest Grossman himself. They took the manuscripts, they even took the typewriter ribbons and the carbon papers. Grossman then writes to Khrushchev afterwards, having believed that in this thaw and after his denunciation of Stalin in the 20th Party Congress, that there was going to be a chance that a book like this could be published. But I think that although he wasn't naive in the sense that he'd already squirreled away a couple of extra copies, he was naive in failing to fully appreciate the reaction of those who'd actually been involved in Stalinism and had a lot to defend themselves.
So he said they arrested the book, didn't they?
They arrested the book.
They arrested the book. They just, so far as he was concerned, it had gone forever. But there's the wonderful story that there was a copy of it that everyone had forgotten about. It was said to be in a satchel, in a dacha, underneath a coat, hanging on, and it had been forgotten about.
Well, I mean, there are many different versions of the stories of how it was saved, but that was certainly one of them. And in fact, there were a couple of manuscripts, and in the end, there were several different microfilms which were smuggled out afterwards. But the key moment was really, I think, after his letter to Khrushchev. He finally gets a reply from Mikhail Suslov, who is the great ideologue on the Central Committee, who actually then tells him verbally that the book is so devastating and so dangerous, if you like, to the Soviet state that it cannot be published for 200, 250 years or whatever.
It's very interesting. He says it can be published, but not for 200 to 300 years, which is kind of...
It's the greatest compliment that any totalitarian regime could possibly...
He didn't believe himself that the state will be...
But this is we are in this odd Russia where at one and the same time they are killing and imprisoning and torturing writers, and yet at some level the state admires the writers and the poets and respects them, knows how dangerous they are, in a way that Western countries don't.
Well, it's an old Russian tradition, because actually even in Tsar's Russia nobody believed politicians or Tsar, but everybody was reading Tolstoy, Chekhov, or Dostoevsky, and they were looking for truth in the books, not in the words of...
But wasn't it Mandelson who sort of said, we take poets seriously in Russia, we shoot poets?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
and
right.
I mean, you remember the phone call of Stalin to Bulgakov, when Bulgakov was actually without money, without job, with no publications, and Stalin phoned us, "How are you today?"
That's right.
And Bulgakov, like a child, was complaining to Stalin that I haven't got job, I haven't got money, nobody wants to employ me. And Stalin told him, well, okay, you can go to Red Army Theatre, maybe they will employ you.
Yeah, but I think Stalin also phoned Pasternak at one point, didn't he?
Well, it was Ehrenberg, I think.
Ehrenberg.
It was Ehrenberg, and I think that's actually where Grossman got the story. I think Ehrenberg told him, because he'd had this midnight telephone call from Stalin, and this comes into Life and Fate, and I think it's one of the great moments of the whole book.
Let's talk about his personal guilt a little bit, Linda, because one of the things that tormented him during the war and for the rest of his life was that his mother had been left behind in part of the Ukraine that was quickly overwhelmed by the Nazis.
Yeah, I understand that his second wife didn't particularly get on with his mother, and that he sent his daughter away to live with his mother. They became separated in his hometown of Berdichev, and the Nazis came in and she was killed. And the book is really suffused with a torment and tragedy about a relationship between sons and mothers. And I think that it's generally agreed that the most momentous chapter in the book is a letter which the Viktor Strum's mother writes to her son from a concentration camp, in which she says, "I want you to know what my last days were like." And it is the most heartbreaking letter, but at the end of it, her final words are, "Live, son, live forever." There is a second moment in the book which is almost more harrowing, I think, where a woman doctor in her 50s...
This is the withering bit.
Yes, a woman doctor in her 50s who is a virgin. She says, the only time she'd ever been touched was by her own mother. She's obviously not had any, emotional life at all, sexual life. And she's on the transport, it's obviously to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and there's a little boy who is on his own. He's come completely disconnected from his parents, and when he is selected for the gas chambers, she is not selected, but she decides to go with him so he should not die alone. And the very last thing that as she holds his hand, she thinks, "At last I am a mother." And these are the last things she thinks before she dies. That is the monumental act of kindness in this novel. And I think it is, a homage out of tremendous guilt on his part that a mother gives life, a mother is there with her son, and that he has failed his own mother. And there is also a moment early on in the book where a mother is going to find her son who has been severely wounded at the front and arrives to find that he has already died. That is also extraordinarily moving. This is a novel of family relationships, particularly between parents and children.
And how important, Andrey, do you think it was to what happened to Grossman, his turning fully against the Stalinist Soviet regime? How important was the experience of the anti-Semitism and the realization that anti-Semitism was almost as rife in the USSR, in parts of the USSR, mentally at least, as it was in the Germany?
I think actually, I believe it was quite a surprise for him, the new wave of anti-Semitism in Moscow when the anti-fascist Jewish committee was disbanded and Mikhail's killed and the other people prosecuted. I think after Auschwitz, after the Holocaust, it was like a second hit on his head, and after this he wouldn't recover. I think he wouldn't believe in anything good coming from the state.
Because for Stalin and Suslov, actually singling out the Jews as the main victims of the Shoah, the Holocaust, was not ideologically acceptable, was it?
It was not correct, yes.
No. In fact, the slogan was, "Do not divide the dead," i.e. they should all be treated as Soviet dead. But Grossman, I think, was, to begin with, didn't believe anti-Semitism. When Ehrenberg warned him about, say, what Sholokov had been saying and the anti-Semitic remarks that he'd made, Grossman simply couldn't believe it at this sort of moment of the Great Patriotic War. How could this happen? It goes back to the thing that he believed that communism was the one bulwark against fascism and anti-Semitism. And this is, I think, where his faith really started to be shaken.
There's a fantastic little detail in the book when Viktor Strum, who's been this very respected physicist, is suddenly, in the crosshairs of this anti-Semitic campaign, and he says that he goes from being from feeling of himself that he's a highly respected physicist to a man with a big nose who is flinching in anticipation of a blow. I think the thing about the Grossman family is that his parents were middle class, they were highly educated. He did not come from a shtetl. Had they done, then they would have been more likely, as my grandparents did, to have left and gone to the West, where he would have had, I suppose, an uneventful life.
That's an astonishing thought. And in terms of his Jewishness, does seem to be reading the book. This is absolutely crucial. This is the thing that the scales fall from his eyes finally about the regime because of that above all.
Yeah, he near the beginning of the book, the lab is being moved, and there's a list of people who are moving and a list of those who aren't. And there's a woman who comes to him and says, "My name isn't on the list." And he says, "Well, we can't take everyone." She says, "But look, everybody whose name is not on the list happens to be Jewish apart from yours, and he dismisses this. And then, you know, he really does become trapped in this, this kind of conspiracy theory, a state-sponsored conspiracy theory, which did not end with the death of Stalin. I mean, it revived again in the 1960s under the name of anti-Zionism all over Eastern Europe. And by the end of it, he really does come to realize that his fate, you know, the other part of the title, is bound up with the fact that he is Jewish, that his mother's fate is that of a Jew and his fate as a physicist is that of a Jew.
I'd like to come back to the sort of texture of the novel a bit, which we haven't talked about so much yet. Because, Andrey, you were talking about his war reporting earlier on, and it seems to me one of the things that you get from this book is that life in the front line of a war like this is horrendous and very noisy, and there's lots of grotesque scenes of carnage, but it's also punctuated by moments of beauty and silence.
Yeah, it's very laconic, very light, and actually I think sometimes he writes these diaries with a very light hand. I mean, it's almost like writing about nature, not about the war. And he pays attention to things which have nothing to do with the war or with the tragedy.
There's a dead German, I think at one point, lying down. His ear fills up with snow.
Yes, and he writes that actually he's lying on the side waiting to be buried.
Yes.
So actually, he expects something normal to be happening to this body, not sort of left.
In terms of the structure of the novel, then, as a novelist, Linda, I mean, one of the things he seems to be able to do is he puts his foot on the accelerator, everything gets louder and bigger and noisier and more horrific, and then suddenly silence, and you're back in the birch forests or at home.
Yeah. I think something that one has to be, I as a writer really feel for Vasily Grossman is he never got a chance to edit this book. It was taken from him. This is really and say it's a first draft, but, it didn't go to an editor. It wasn't edited properly. The other thing to say about it, which I didn't find out until quite recently, is that it's actually a sequel to another book, which I believe, though I may be wrong, has not even been translated. So when you approach this novel, you're approaching something which is, like War and Peace, very large, with a huge cast of characters, where you're constantly ricocheting back and forth between...
you have to keep checking the names, don't you?
Well, I would say anybody who is purchasing this book, you will find, as I did not find until I was halfway through it, a cast of characters at the back, which is extremely helpful because it helps you to understand the relationships between these people who seem not to be related at all. So sometimes you're following individuals and families for hundreds of pages, and they come and they go and they come and they go. So the journey from the gas chamber takes place over several sections, over several hundred pages. Sometimes characters or situations will only appear for a few pages, or even 1 or 2 pages, and they're gone. And what happens, which is, it's challenging for the reader, but it is completely brilliant. He cuts off people's stories because they die. And you think, but I want to know what happened next. Nothing happened next. They died. That's the point. And it is the sudden death which occurs to many of these characters in the middle of these monumental stories, which is so, gut-wrenching.
Absolutely.
When I read the book, it took me 3 weeks to read it and 3 weeks to recover from reading it, when I didn't actually read anything else. And tragically, I was the only person I knew who'd even heard of the book, apart from Anthony. Apart from even read it. So I was held in this kind of horrible isolation unit with it going round and round and round in my head.
But actually, some of his earlier works, before publishing, he had to change 9-10 times on demands of the editor or on the censor.
Yeah, so he was constantly...
So he was constantly changing, not freely, not voluntarily, his texts.
There's a kind of rising bubble of interest in Grossman in the West. And I mean, he's becoming more and more famous almost month by month. Yeah. What's going on in Russia and the Ukraine, Andrey?
Quite the opposite.
Really?
I think sort of he is going down and down because actually this book is not, I would say, up to Putin's liking or government's liking, because the things, I mean, there is a definite revival of Stalinism or respect to Stalin. After several remarks by Putin about Stalin as a good crisis manager in difficult times, suddenly there were two biographies of Lavrenti Beria describing also Beria as a good manager, crisis manager in difficult times.
The great executioner.
Yeah. And in Ukraine, somehow he's forgotten because he wrote in Russian, because he lived in Moscow. He was considered sort of more Russian Jew. And, but also we had recently a monument, a new monument to Stalin in Zaporozhye, installed by the communists. Then it was damaged by the nationalists, and two young nationalists were put into prison for damaging Stalin's monument.
And so why, when you write your novels, have you turned to satire, Mr. Colonel?
Well, I get too much material from my country. Yes.
Anthony, we wouldn't know nearly so much about aspects of the Second World War had it not been for this novelist proposition. I mean, you've written famously and wonderfully on the fall of Berlin and Stalingrad and all the rest of it, but he was one of the great tellers of truth, bringing the sort of original stories and materials out, wasn't he?
Absolutely. When I started on researching on Stalingrad with Lyuda Vinogradova, this was back in 1995, at that stage we didn't actually know what had happened to a lot of the material. And certainly, I mean, talking about the notebooks at that particular point. And so when we started looking through the State Archive for Literature and the Arts, suddenly they were there. And one realized immediately, I'd already read Life and Fate, and so knew that Grossman was an extraordinary witness. And that was why we were very, very interested in these notebooks, because here you had literally the contemporary eyewitness at that particular moment jotting things down with his astonishing observation. So from that point of view, one actually had what was said about Grossman. You know, he wrote the ruthless truth of war. And there was no other account. You can read, whether you're reading Simonov, whether you're reading all of the others, they're all flavoured by propaganda. I'm not saying that they're totally untrue. I mean, obviously there was heroism, but what one had to see was the other side of the coin as well. And that was really what we were finding in the archives.
This is full of squabbling generals fighting over who gets the best dugout and who's going to take responsibility.
Which is absolutely true. I mean, you know, Grossman himself was horrified after the Battle of Stalingrad, after this huge sacrifice, that Chuikov, the great hero of the 62nd Army, was sort of more interested in rivals over who was going to get the credit.
And just following on from Andrey's point about what's happened to his reputation, there is the extraordinary fact that, if it's still true, that at the great Stalingrad memorial, in gold, the words are Grossman's, but he's not credited because he's become an unperson.
Yeah.
Astonishing. Let's really cut to the chase then and ask, does this match up to War and Peace in any respect? We know that Grossman carried War and Peace around with him during the war. I think he said it was the only thing that he could bear to read during the war.
And he read it twice, yes.
And he read it, yeah. So what do we think? Linda?
You've put me in a very difficult position here. I've never managed to finish War and Peace. But I've read this 3 times. What does that tell you? I think it has to be one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. I accept that it's a daunting read. I don't accept that it's any more daunting than War and Peace. The fact that perhaps that, you know, I find War and Peace a duller book than this.
Well, I would agree.
Really?
I would agree, yes.
And especially the historical lectures that one gets.
War and Peace is very pompous.
Yes, exactly.
And the author is there more important than his characters. And actually, there are no little people there with their real sort of problems and emotions.
Well, we've been discussing a kind of culture of censorship, so it's difficult for me, but I have to come in and say it is official Radio 4 policy that no novel is greater than War and Peace. Certainly my view. So if we've reached the point where Grossman is dying, His great life's work has been seized by the KGB. And he really thought, did he not, that it would never be read by anybody. I mean, the notion of people sitting in Oxford or sitting in Britain discussing this book would have been utterly incredible to him.
Yeah, whenever I get a bad review, I remember that. I thought Vasily Grossman didn't even get to see the greatest masterpiece, or one of the great masterpieces of the 20th century published, and believed it was just going into darkness. I think for any novelist to know that not only is your work unpublished, unread, but that it may never see the light of day is horrific.
We shouldn't be too finger-wagging, but is this a book that everybody should read? Everybody who's interested in history or the novel?
I'm sure everybody should read it. And then maybe if his earlier, more socialist, realist short stories are published in English, I think it would be very interesting for the readers to compare early idealist and almost communist Grossman with the later idealist but already anti-communist.
Anthony, an essential book?
Yes. I mean, anybody who wants to understand the whole of the Stalinist era, but also that interrelationship between fascism and communism and the way that it dominated the whole of the 20th century, as well as wanting to enjoy a fascinating family story. It is all there.
Well, Linda, you've already said it was better than War and Peace, so I don't need to ask you to revisit that painful parallel, at least to me. Thank you all very much indeed. The audience, I have to say, can make up its own mind, because Radio 4 is going to be dramatising Life and Fate from the 18th of September with an all-star cast, including Kenneth, Branagh and many more. Meanwhile, thanks to all my guests here at St Peter's College, Oxford. Anthony Beevor, whose next book on the Second World War will be published next June. Andrey, whose latest novel is The Milkman in the Night, and a splendid read, I have to say. And Linda Grant, who's written the introduction to the latest edition of Life and Fate. Next week, Style is Everything, as we discuss postmodernism, icons, and the cyber underworld with Misha Glenny, Martin Kemp, and Jane Pavitt. But for now, thank you and goodbye. In a sense, something like a kind of Russian George Orwell, although a better novelist than Orwell. And today's programme is all about him and his great work. I'm joined by Anthony Beevor, the historian, by the novelists Linda Grant, and by Andrey, who is, like Grossman, a Ukrainian. And what I thought I'd start by asking you all is, if somebody pressed you against the wall and said, Life and Fate, what sort of a book is it? Let's put to one side that it's incredibly moving and brilliant and so on. Just what sort of book is it? Anthony Beevor.
It is, I think, definitely the 20th century equivalent of War and Peace, and that was a deliberate literary homage on Grossman's part. But in many ways it's much more than War and Peace, because the political element, the humanistic element that it introduces is far broader, far greater. For the very first time, we see the whole question of, is there a moral equivalence between class genocide or racial genocide, the comparison between the Nazi state and the Soviet state, and to what degree these two millstones together actually worked together in crushing everybody in between.
You make it sound quite a daunting prospect for somebody who's looking for a novel to curl up with.
It's a gripping read. The family, I mean, when I refer to War and Peace, it has a similar sprawling, epic family side to it. And the characters are so beautifully written and depicted because of Grossman's power of observation that I think one is completely carried away by them. You know them so well by the end of it.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. If you're writing a novel about Russians repelling invaders and you choose to call it Life and Fate, you're setting yourself a high bar. Vasily Grossman certainly intended the comparison with Tolstoy's War and Peace, which was his favourite reading. Grossman, Jewish, short-sighted, slightly plump, trained as a scientist, was one of the least likely heroic war reporters of World War II. But he was there at the siege of Stalingrad, the great tank battles, first into Treblinka, and he then saw the fall of Berlin. He turned savagely against the lies and the anti-Semitism of Stalin's USSR.
The struggle for life lies in the individual, in his modest peculiarities and his right to these peculiarities. And the enormous reward of reading this book is the level of the human and the humane, of a vast variety of characters, from Hitler and Stalin themselves down to a nameless old woman.
Andrey Kurkov, you also come from the same area, and you write novels which have a political content, a satirical content, quite a lot of the time. What about the structure of this book? Because it isn't, in many ways, it starts as a family book, doesn't it?
Well, it starts with beautiful description of horrible sin, of the road to the camp, to the German camp, actually. And and he's extremely talented in writing beautifully about horrible things. I think the book is actually about how wonderful and how difficult.
Lyuda, you're somebody who just leapt on this book and has been enthusiastic about it ever since.
Yes, and I'm not somebody who would normally read a book about the Battle of Stalingrad or indeed any form of military history until I read Antony's book, Berlin, which led me to Grossman. I'm going to slightly disagree with Antony in his definition. And I'm also going to agree with Vasily Grossman when he said, my book is not political. His overlords and masters said, of course it is political. But I think it isn't, because I think that what he does is, in fact, to take an axe to big ideas. He destroys communism, he destroys fascism, he destroys Christianity in a way. What he does, and here is, I think, the killer quote, for me, the message of the book lies in this: the only true and lasting meaning of